By early 1944, Adolf Hitler had fully retreated into his fantasy of Fortress Europe. Despite the heavy and continuous Allied bombing campaigns across Germany and the relentless draining pressure exerted by the Soviet forces on the vast Eastern Front, he remained unshakably convinced that the colossal coastal defenses he had personally ordered built the so-called Atlantic Wall were an impregnable, insurmountable barrier. This profound faith was not based on sound engineering or realistic logistical reports, but stemmed almost entirely from his deep, almost messianic personal conviction and the sycophancy of his top commanders, who dared not challenge his optimism. He firmly believed that the Allies would surely attempt an invasion, but that they would be hurled back into the sea with catastrophic losses. This extreme overconfidence was the dangerous foundation of the massive intelligence failure that was about to unfold, as the Führer's critical strategic decisions regarding troop deployment were already rigidly cemented in personal delusion, not in objective military fact or reconnaissance. Hitler's greatest and most persistent strategic dilemma in the crucial spring of 1944 was not if the Allies would invade the continent, but the agonizing question of where precisely they would strike and when that attack would materialize. The massive, indispensable commitment of tank and infantry divisions required to hold the Eastern Front against the numerically superior Soviets meant that reserves in the West were chronically scarce and desperately needed. He was therefore forced into the strategically perilous position of splitting his valuable resources between two vast, demanding theaters. The key to the German defense of the West was thus not massive force, but rather perfect strategic positioning of the available forces. Every German general deeply understood that the invasion would have to be defeated decisively at the landing beaches themselves, as a debilitating lack of mobility and fuel would make pushing the Allies out of a securely established, fully supplied beachhead nearly impossible later on. The Allied deception plan, a masterpiece of misdirection codenamed Operation Fortitude, designed specifically to mislead the Germans about the true location of the invasion, relied heavily on one pivotal man, a Spanish double agent codenamed Garbo, the real name being Juan Pujol Garcia. Garbo was arguably the most successful and pivotal double agent of the entire war. With breathtaking audacity and skill, he managed to fully convince the entire German High Command, OKW, that he controlled a vast, sprawling, and highly effective network of dedicated spies operating across Britain. His meticulously detailed, often frantic, but entirely false reports were considered by German intelligence, the Abwehr, to be the most reliable, unimpeachable source on Allied intentions, giving him unmatched influence over Hitler's strategic thinking. Garbo's primary and most critical goal throughout the spring was to sell the powerful lie that the true massive invasion force, the entirely fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, which existed only on paper, was concentrated in southeast England, directly opposite the narrowest point of the English Channel, Pas de Calais. This location made perfect geographic, logistical, and military sense to the vast majority of German commanders, reinforcing their own theories. Garbo relentlessly flooded the Abwehr with specific, convincing reports about fake army unit badges, the strategic concentration of fictitious supply depots, and the engineered movements of non-existent divisions around the ports of Dover and Kent. This deception directly fed and dangerously reinforced Hitler's own preconceived, rigid notion that any major, decisive attack would logically target the most efficient and shortest crossing point. Hitler suffered severely from the classic cognitive trap of confirmation bias. Once he fixated on a strategic idea, he possessed an almost pathological tendency to seek out and accept only the evidence that unequivocally supported it, dismissing all else as defeatism. His powerful belief that the Allies would strike primarily at Pas de Calais was so deeply ingrained that it swiftly transcended mere theory and became policy. He felt the Normandy coastline, with its weaker port facilities and rougher seas, was simply too logistically ambitious and militarily challenging for the Allies to attempt as the main landing. He therefore issued crucial orders, mandating that the best available German forces, including the absolutely vital 15th Army and most of the armoured reserves, be permanently positioned well north of the Seine River, covering Calais, essentially writing off the landings at Normandy as nothing more than a tactical feint. The night before the invasion was a chaotic maelstrom of confusion and conflicting reports for German intelligence services. Heavy winds and rough seas had actually caused the German command to relax their watch posture, convinced that no landing was remotely imminent in such severe weather. Yet, strange, alarming activity was reported across the entire channel. A massive spike in coded radio traffic, Allied aircraft dropping reflective metal foil, chaff, to severely confuse radar systems, and, most ominously, the BBC broadcast of coded messages, lines of poetry, and strange phrases known to be crucial signals for the French resistance to begin widespread sabotage actions. Despite these multiple glaring indicators, the German High Command remained tragically paralyzed, unsure if this was truly the main event or just another massive, complex Allied feint designed to exhaust their reserves. In the extremely early hours of June 6th, the Allies executed their first key strategic move: widespread airborne landings. Thousands of paratroopers and glider forces descended behind the designated Normandy beaches, quickly securing critical river crossings, bridges, and communication hubs. The German command recognized this specific activity, but Garbo's final, frantic message arrived with devastating timing, still intensely emphasizing the deception. He claimed the Normandy landings were clearly a diversionary attack of limited, finite scope, designed purely to draw German reserves away from the true, imminent invasion at Pas de Calais. This report, arriving precisely at the moment of extreme crisis, gave Hitler the exact justification he needed to rigidly maintain his long-held, disastrous, fixed idea. As dawn broke over the 5 invasion beaches, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the sheer, overwhelming scale of the Allied operation could no longer be credibly denied by the local German defenders on the ground. Hundreds of ships, thousands of landing craft, and a relentless, non-stop aerial and naval bombardment hammered the Atlantic Wall defenses. The commanders, who were fighting desperately on the ground in Normandy, immediately sent urgent, desperate pleas to Hitler's headquarters for armored reserves and immediate reinforcement. The Allied strength was clearly overwhelming for a mere diversionary attack. This was the moment of first factual exposure to reality, but the high-ranking decision-makers, far away from the carnage, were still entirely blinded by the effectiveness of Operation Fortitude. Crucially, when the invasion was confirmed in the early morning, Hitler was profoundly fast asleep, having taken a powerful sleeping pill late the night before. His personal staff, terrified of waking him after he had taken his medication, and perhaps even more terrified of incurring his legendary explosive temper, hesitated for hours to authorize the necessary release of the vital armored reserve divisions, especially the elite Panzer Lehr Division and 1st SS Panzer Division. These armored reserves were designated as Führer Reserve and were under his direct personal control, locked down until he awoke. The subsequent fatal delay in activating these powerful forces, which were capable of launching a decisive and effective counterattack on D-Day itself, proved to be one of the war's most costly and irreversible command blunders. The Führer's sleep provided the Allies with a critical, unearned window of opportunity to establish their hold. Even after Hitler was finally awakened and fully informed of the massive landings, the confusion within the German command structure continued unabated. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B and was nominally responsible for the Atlantic Wall, was miles away at his home in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, also convinced that the bad weather ruled out any immediate invasion. He was caught completely and catastrophically off guard. The resulting delay in communication, coupled with the rigid, top-heavy centralized command structure that mandated Hitler's direct, personal approval for all major troop movements, created a catastrophic lack of coherent, unified response in the critical first 12 hours of the invasion. Hitler's first realization that the attack was, in fact, not a diversion was agonizingly slow and came in fits and starts. He received numerous confirmed reports detailing the immense size of the Allied naval task force and the sheer ferocity of the fighting on beaches like Omaha. However, he simultaneously received deliberately intercepted Allied communications, which Fortitude had carefully allowed to leak, that continued to discuss Fusag's readiness to follow up the Normandy feint. Hitler's delusion fought fiercely with reality. He conceded that Normandy was a strong and major attack, but he rigidly clung to the idea that the main, decisive event was still hours or days away, expected at any moment further north at Pas de Calais. This is the absolutely central moment of the successful betrayal. After the invasion had commenced, Garbeau was immediately instructed by his British handlers to dramatically confess to the Abwehr that he had only just discovered the true, deceptive purpose of the Normandy landings. He claimed his elaborate network had been temporarily too slow to react, and then he immediately reinforced the narrative that the Allied commanders were now rapidly preparing to launch the main Pas-de-Calais invasion to exploit the subsequent confusion created by the Normandy attack. This was a breathtakingly audacious, manipulative lie, essentially performing an act of self-incrimination only to reinforce the larger, catastrophic strategic deception in the minds of the German High Command. Crucially, Hitler accepted this dramatic confession from Garbeau, interpreting it as ultimate confirmation of his own long-held fixed idea. It provided him with evidence that he had been half right all along. Calais was the real, ultimate target. Therefore, the intelligence failure was not the fault of the Führer's rigid, flawed thinking, but merely the temporary slowness and incompetence of his spies on the ground. This single, successfully accepted lie saved Operation Fortitude for another 3 absolutely critical weeks. Hitler now knew his spies had previously lied about the timing and nature of the Normandy operation, but he was disastrously convinced they were now telling the unvarnished truth about the imminent Calais follow-up. The most direct, immediate, and devastating result of this acceptance was Hitler's absolute and unwavering refusal to release the 15th Army, the Corps Reserve Group, consisting of over 19 divisions, stationed around Pas-de-Calais. General Hans von Salmuth, commanding the 15th Army, repeatedly and desperately pleaded for permission to move his massive force south to reinforce the collapsing defenses in Normandy. Hitler flatly and aggressively refused. He feared that moving the 15th Army prematurely would expose the true target, Calais, and allow the Allies to land Fusag unopposed. For weeks, the 15th Army, with its substantial armoured and infantry power, sat catastrophically idle in the north, while the irreversible fate of the entire Western Front was being decided just a few hundred miles away in the brutal fighting in Normandy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, was tragically the only senior commander on the ground who grasped the terrifying and immediate reality. The Allies were in France to stay, and their bridgehead was permanent. He personally witnessed the sheer ferocity of the landings and the remarkable logistical genius of the Allies, like the prefabricated Mulberry harbours. He desperately argued that every single available man and tank must be thrown immediately against the Normandy beachhead before the Allies could break out and gain manoeuvre room. But his urgent appeals were consistently dismissed as mere defeatism by Hitler and his inner circle, who maintained that Rommel was foolishly wasting resources fighting a diversion and must husband his strength for the main event that they still disastrously believed was coming. Even when reserve divisions were eventually and reluctantly released by Hitler, their movement toward the front was brutally crippled by overwhelming and total Allied air superiority. The Allies controlled the skies completely, attacking German rail lines, vital bridges, and troop columns with relentless, punishing precision. What should have been a relatively swift two-day move from central France to the Normandy battle zone became a grueling, week-long, costly nightmare. The movement of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite armored units, was decimated by air attacks and logistics breakdowns before it even reached the front. This total aerial dominance served as the painful physical enforcement of the initial deception plan. The Luftwaffe, once the proud, fearsome spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, was virtually non-existent over the invasion beaches and surrounding airspace. German combat pilots were scarce, aviation fuel was critically low, and replacement aircraft were being systematically destroyed on the ground faster than they could be manufactured and delivered. For the German soldiers fighting and dying on the beaches, the total silence of their own air force was profoundly demoralizing, serving as a brutal, constant reminder of the Allied industrial and material might. This complete lack of air reconnaissance also meant the Germans had no independent means whatsoever to verify the continued, phantom existence of the fictional Fusag in southeast England. By late June and early July, the sheer, crushing weight of Allied logistics, combined with the total exhaustion of the remaining German forces who had suffered massive casualties, allowed the Allies to launch Operation Cobra, the massive and decisive breakout from the narrow Normandy bridgehead. German resistance, while tenacious and fierce, finally and irrevocably collapsed. The invasion was no longer a desperate beach fight. It had transitioned into a full-scale, fast-moving campaign. This operational success was the final, irrefutable, and bloody proof that Normandy was the main and only effort. The powerful forces that had been rigidly held back at Calais were now hopelessly, uselessly positioned, watching the inevitable defeat pass them by. Roughly 1 month after the D-Day landings, German intelligence was finally forced to formally dismantle the Fusag illusion. Detailed reports from surviving Abwehr agents in Britain, combined with a total baffling lack of follow-up activity at Calais, finally compelled the OKW to concede that the fictional army group had been a complete and total fabrication. However, even at this disastrously late stage, Hitler was still profoundly reluctant to accept the truth fully, viewing it primarily as a massive, humiliating intelligence blunder committed by others rather than a definitive sign of his own disastrous strategic failure. The confirmation that his spies had been deliberately fed lies by a hostile agency was immensely and personally humiliating to the Führer. When the full, comprehensive scale of the deception was finally confirmed to Hitler, he flew into one of his legendary, self-destructive rages. But his fury was not directed solely at Allied cunning and deception. It was directed violently inward at his own staff. He immediately suspected widespread treachery and profound incompetence within his own intelligence services. The fact that the Abwehr had been so completely and catastrophically duped reinforced his growing and increasingly violent paranoia that he was surrounded by traitors and soft-minded incompetents. This painful realization led directly to the final, fatal erosion of his trust in his career military commanders, accelerating the centralized, delusional, and micromanaging control he exerted over all subsequent military decisions. The organizational fallout was swift and extremely brutal for German intelligence. Already under deep suspicion, the Abwehr, military intelligence, was virtually dismantled and destroyed in 1944. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, its head, was already deeply involved in anti-Hitler plots and was summarily removed from command and eventually executed. The entire intelligence network was transferred almost completely to the RSHA, Reich Main Security Office, under the direct monolithic control of the SS, specifically to the SD, Sicherheitsdienst, which was far more loyal to the party's ideology than to objective military fact. This drastic organizational move ensured that all future intelligence reports would prioritize ideological loyalty over objective truth, fundamentally and permanently blinding Hitler to reality. The successful Allied invasion of Normandy, which was crucially facilitated by Garbeau's well-placed lies, provided the final desperate impetus for the German military resistance groups. The conspirators behind the July 20th plot, the attempt to assassinate Hitler, urgently needed the Allies to be successfully established on the continent, to be credible partners in a post-Hitler peace. The devastating realization that Hitler's disastrous strategic decisions, namely holding back the entire 15th Army due to a spy's calculated lie, had irrevocably and permanently doomed the Western Front, cemented the conspirators' belief that eliminating the Führer was the only desperate action left to save Germany from total, final destruction. The D-Day intelligence failure was thus the plot's ultimate, unassailable justification. It wasn't until weeks after the massive Allied breakout that Hitler reluctantly and finally authorized the wholesale transfer of the 15th Army southwards towards the fighting. By this time, it was tragically and completely too late to make any strategic difference. The German defeat in the West was already strategically complete and irreversible. When the 15th Army finally engaged, they did so in a chaotic, defensive, and ultimately doomed campaign, utterly unable to reverse the massive territorial gains already made by the relentless Allies. The entire saga demonstrated the tragic, terrifying power of a single, well-executed deception to neutralize an entire army group and permanently skew a dictator's final, crucial strategic decision. As for the master double agent Garbeau, his job was spectacularly done. The man who had convinced Hitler that his spies were only temporarily slow, only to successfully maintain the great strategic deception, was deservedly hailed as an intelligence genius by the Allies. He was incredibly awarded both the German Iron Cross for his fictional network's superb but fake work, and the British MBE for his real decisive work. The absurd fact that the Germans awarded him a high honor after he had exposed and destroyed their most vital defensive position perfectly encapsulates the depth and sheer absurdity of Hitler's intelligence failure and his total inability to accept reality. The Führer was not only defeated by armies and factories, but by the theatrical, psychological genius of a single, unseen actor. The D-Day intelligence debacle stands as a chilling, unforgettable testament to the profound dangers of a supreme leader prioritizing personal, rigid conviction over objective, unpalatable fact. Hitler's dogmatic belief that his spies were only partially wrong, and that the ultimate target remained Pas de Calais, critically held back the decisive military force needed to crush the Normandy landings in their infancy. The resulting inability of the Germans to launch a timely, effective counterattack doomed the entire Western Front. The incredible story of Garbeau is the ultimate historical lesson of how a single, well-crafted, and strategically placed lie, when fed to a prepared, delusional mind, can irrevocably decide the fate of nations and change the course of world history.